So, hey guys, today we're going to be talking about the different deck types. So, we're going to be talking about control decks, combo decks, uh, FTKs, going second decks, and all of that. So, let's start. Okay, so we have control decks, so that'd be something like trap tricks, I guess. So, control decks have have like the following attributes. They are not super good, going second because you mainly play around your trap cards. So to start, to go second in general, right, with a trap deck is pretty awkward. So you would have to see your opponent do whatever their turn is. Not super important, right? So it could be an FTK deck, a combo deck, or another control deck, and no matter what, you are essentially in disadvantage from this point onwards, right? During turn 2, because when you set your cards on the second turn, your opponent can still technically build advantage, like with, for example, Vanquish Soul. Vanquish Soul does 2 searches on your turn, and then 2 or so on their turn, and then they can search again on their turn for a total of like 6 searches, assuming they are going first. If they're going second, they'll only get to do 2 searches technically, like even if you don't interrupt them, right? So normal summon Razin, add Xiaolong effect, right? So that's like 2 searches, but if it is you that is going second, they get 4 additional searches, which is like 3 times the amount of searches. So that is why control decks generally are not that great. Going second at least, right? So pretty big going second weakness, I guess. Yeah. So on the second turn you have to set your cards and you can't really do anything till turn 3. So that's how it kind of goes. So next let's do a combo deck. So let's do a fun one. Let's go with Blackwing, sure. So there are a lot of different combo decks. Why does this show up when I search Blackwing? Black. And then, where's Wing in this card? What? Sending, and field, special summon. Follow Wing. I see. So I guess Snake Eyes is kind of a combo deck. Yshtira is also a combo deck, but we're mostly going to focus on Blackwing here, I guess. So Blackwing is a combo deck, of course, right? So noticeably also not that great going second, but the going first power of combo decks is pretty good to an extent. So with combo decks, right? Uh, they're a little bit better at going second than control decks, but keep in mind, control decks technically also have access to cards that are just raw floodgates, right? So like skill drain and stuff, right? So if you play skill drain, this is technically arguably infinite negates. So yeah, just for example, let's see. If I pull up this card, right? Uh, the Agent of Creation Venus. Technically, how many times can this card be activated? So if you pay 5,000 life points, for example, 10 times. So if we had Apollosa, for example, negating this, this doesn't really have the capacity to be negated at all by Apollosa, right? So you only need to resolve this 3 times to summon out all your Shine Balls, right? So if we pay, let's say 7.5k life points, it's not like we die from this. So yeah, uh, that's doable. If your opponent just has like raw negates, no negate destroyer or anything like that, just normal negates. But if we have like a skill drain, then you're not going to be able to resolve this even once, even if you activate this 100 times, for example. So that's kind of how that goes, I guess. So yeah. Anyway, back to this. So combo decks usually have play around 1 to 2 card combos, But the going first ability is essentially all they have is kind of how it feels. So going second, you do not have a good matchup into other combo decks. Realistically, you don't have a good matchup into controlled decks. You don't really have that many good matchups into many things, especially going second, right? The only saving grace of going second is essentially having hand traps or board breakers. If you don't have those, your combo engine, depending on like the exact combo deck, right? It, it's not going to, well, the engine specifically is not going to serve you that well in particular, right? So if we had just like any engine, I guess, for like a combo deck that feels good to play going second, now that'd be a small miracle, I guess. So if we look at Mech Knights, that's probably the closest one I can think of that kind of plays around like your opponent, what your opponent has, and it's innate within the like I guess engine, and it doesn't directly break the board, which I think is pretty cool, anyways. So nothing really like that, and then we have like I guess essentially two different types of combo decks. So we could divide these into essentially interaction and then negation. So there are like certain decks and certain combo decks which focus more on interaction than negates. So the Abyssar is kind of like that, but still has like the option to make Appo, which is kind of negates. But if we go to Kichdira, for example, or Pearly, they don't actually have any ways to really negate if you just consider uh, their engine, like without any outside engines, there's no negates happening, right? So banish card, lock zone, banish cards, banish cards, banish cards, banish cards, banish cards. So also no protection. So then the weakness of going first, like combo decks, would be just simply going second decks. More so those with only interaction being like really vulnerable to stuff like kaijus, Raigeki, and all that evenly matched. All of those are fairly strong into like combo decks. So when you load up on certain types of hand traps as well, like Droll, Shifter, and then start dropping stuff like Raigeki or like kaijus, uh, most combo decks will like crumble, even if you have to like kaiju first and then Raigeki. You're probably going to have your like board crumble to pieces and then OTK relatively swiftly. So I guess for this we'll just put in Gizmek Orochi for going second. And yeah, sure. So yeah, going second decks essentially also will run probably backer removal, like for example Lightning Storm, and Lightning Storm is just Duster if you're just going second every single time or evenly. So those cards are always live in a going second deck because you are pretty much always going second unless you're kind of in a mirror situation where someone forces you to go first for whatever reason. Aside from that, yeah, going second cards are fairly strong, right? And you have like in general the capacity to run backer removal for control decks and then like certain monster removal cards against combo decks, so you're doing pretty well. So then after this, we have FTK decks, which actually beats like all of these decks, but only going first, which is awkward. So let's just grab Exodia, I guess, to represent them. Sure. So with FTK decks, noticeably, uh, their win con can be achieved essentially on the first turn, which beats every single one of these types of decks in general. So typically, though, with going second decks, they're running more board breakery stuff primarily. They do run some forms of hand traps, but they tend not to run that many hand traps. I think it's like about 6 to 9 hand traps usually, maybe a bit less. So it's usually going to be hanging around maybe 6 or 5 even, depending on like the exact builds, but it's actually not that much. So typically with going second decks, they're built more as like board breaker decks. So if there is no turn two and they already lose the game, you can see how bad that deck fares, right? Or this deck type fares, right? So then we also have like combo decks. Combo decks primarily will rely on hand traps to kind of like potentially stop your plays. But yeah, if you're FTK, for example, just tank a few hand traps and be perfectly fine. This is just going to beat the majority of just combo decks then, right? Because the general play is to set up board or set up OTK, and that is typically just how combo is going to be played, and you won't have typically good enough. Um, I don't think you have good enough like hand traps to be able to probably stop like just someone setting up some sort of FTK. And then we have Diabellstar. So with Diabellstar is also kind of like this, where uh, all of your primary things require, like all of your combo pieces and whatnot, require it to be your turn. So what if your turn never comes? So that's essentially what we have here with uh, combo decks, control decks, and going second decks. So these decks all lose to essentially FTKs. Well, if we're thinking about like matchup wise, they're in a lot of disadvantage because you require a turn to be able to play the game with your deck. But if you do not have a turn and you just immediately lose, there is very little in the way of counterplay. So going second, of course, like FTK like Exodia wouldn't be able to resolve that well. So that is kind of the caveat, but at one point in the game there was actually an FTK that was really consistent and didn't require that many hand cards or anything like that. So that was essentially End Magician. So you would just make like double starving Supreme King Starving Venom, probably make a Baron as well. And then you would use like Verte to instant fusion out the Leerlisk fusion monster, and then you would just copy that sucker's effect, and then you would just burn your opponent for game. So that's kind of how that worked. And that was probably the strongest deck at that time because it has such a going first advantage in that sense. So it was a bit better than these combo decks. And even if you didn't have enough material for the FTK, you could still transition back into like actual like negate endboard and stuff, right? So it was pretty good in that regard. It was really consistent in doing the FTK though, so going first, it essentially beat like all of these decks anyways. So yeah, that's kind of how the the matchups kind of work for all these different types of decks. So if we were to think about the strongest possible deck just based off of like these parameters, right? We're just focusing on control decks, FTKs, and all that. The strongest possible type of deck in Yu-Gi-Oh is probably just going to be an FTK that can play going second. So if that were the case, it would have a winning matchup against literally everything, and that's quite problematic, honestly. So that would beat all of these back row set decks. You'd just be able to like drop like evenly or lightning storm duster or whatever and completely wipe out all the back row. Then you're free to do your FTK or OTK or whatever, right? And then there is like, for example, I don't know, let's say Blackwing goes first. You drop like Dark Ruler no more or whatever, or maybe your engine is actually able to contribute to the FTK. Like, for example, then you might activate Mikanko Arabesque or like some kind of equivalent card, kind of like that, that will mess with your opponent's end board, weaken it, while strengthening your own, and building advantage. So if you have cards like that in an FTK, it'd be pretty effective going second as well. And the strongest type of FTK that kind of fits these parameters is going to be one that specifically doesn't rely on like certain main deck cards. So it's closer to like the Supreme King Starving Venom one, where the majority of your FTK is going to be in the extra deck, so you don't get bricked on these, and it also helps with consistency. So like if we have like Verte, Supreme King Starving Venoms, and then like the Leerless card, technically that's only 2 extra deck slots we had to reserve for the FTK. The rest is normal engine, right? So something like that would be ideal. So if such a deck did exist currently, and also the FTK would have to be like fairly consistent, right? We're talking like able to tank 1 to 2 interruptions probably, and still be able to go second. So at that point, uh, that deck would obviously be completely busted. So not even the Penned Magician FTK list was this disgusting. It was like a few steps away from that. If they had stronger engine pieces that were more consistent, like essentially super heavy samurai, being able to one card out a lot of stuff, that would be essentially the strongest deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! And it would have a winning matchup against everything. But as this doesn't exist right now, we're just going to focus on what we do have. So with combo decks, you're typically weak, super weak, going second, but you have like some going first, or you have some going second ability with hand traps and some like generic stuff. Like you can run Lightning Storm in combo, right? Or like Duster, but you generally don't have that much room for it. And then control decks, uh, you can't really go second at all for the most part. The only saving grace is that uh, specifically monster negation and interaction is much more common than back row interaction, which makes your decks very consistent and strong, right? In that sense, right? Because the types of interaction and removal for back row are much more limited. And then not only that, but just a lot of people are going to a lot more people are running combos, so you'll be like playing against hand traps and stuff, which are typically not as effective against control decks. And then with going second decks, hand traps are not generally that effective against control or going second decks. Aside from like Mikako specifically, Mikako might be the only deck that is going second deck that really gets hurt by hand traps. Aside from that, I guess Mech Knight gets hurt a little bit, but I don't know if it's that significant. And of course, you're affected by hand traps pretty hard with combo decks, just in general. Just for example, Shifter, turn ending. Shifter is not going to be turn ending against a control deck. They should still be able to somewhat play. Yeah. FTKs are kind of weak to hand traps as well, because that is all you can do to an FTK, because if you run, for example, evenly matched Dark Ruler no more, there will never be a second turn to run those cards. So you don't have a chance to activate these cards, and yeah. Every single deck has like a different matchup almost against every other type of deck. Uh, for like going second and going first, there's like a different amount of advantage to each, so Yu-Gi-Oh is a little bit interesting in that regard. So, yeah, that's about all I wanted to say, I guess. So, yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.